Why did Sauron want Mithril? We find out in The Lord of the Rings that he covets it, but why? What was he planning? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's legendarium, as well as other great fantasy worlds like A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. Welcome. In The Fellowship of the Ring, while explaining the significance of Moria and Mithril to the Fellowship, Gandalf says this: "The dwarves tell no tale, but even as Mithril was the foundation of their wealth, so also was it their destruction. They delved too greedily and too deep, and disturbed that from which they fled, Durin's bane. Of what they brought to light, the orcs have gathered nearly all, and given it in tribute to Sauron, who covets it." It's little more than a passing reference, but an intriguing one, as it hints at something that perhaps might have been going on behind the scenes of the story. Sauron coveted Mithril and was collecting it for some reason. Why? Well, you don't need to be a Middle-earth expert to know that Mithril is pretty amazing. Gandalf carries on after that reference to Sauron to say this: "Mithril. All folk desired it. It could be beaten like copper and polished like glass, and the dwarves could make of it a metal, light and yet harder than tempered steel. Its beauty was like that of common silver, but the beauty of Mithril did not tarnish or grow dim. The elves dearly loved it, and among many uses they made of it Ithildin, star moon, which you saw upon the doors. Bilbo had a corselet of Mithril rings that Thorin gave him. I wonder what has become of it. I never told him, but its worth was greater than the value of the whole Shire and everything in it." So we can immediately say that Sauron coveting Mithril just makes sense. Everyone did. It was valuable and very useful. But with Mithril being such an adaptable metal, making both beautiful decoration and formidable armaments, we have to wonder whether he had something particularly in mind for it, rather than just stockpiling it like a dragon hoard. Which isn't to say that stockpiling it would have been against Sauron's best interests. On the contrary, it denied his opponents access to the scarce resource, and by limiting supply, I'm sure the price of it went even higher, bolstering his coffers all the more. Sauron the speculative investor there. But I think there is more to it than just that, because we do have a clue to build on. Tolkien wrote lots of little notes to himself as he was writing, and in one of his drafts, near to the section we just read, he wrote this: "Mithril is now nearly all lost. Orcs plunder it and pay tribute to Sauron, who is collecting it, we don't know why, for some secret purpose of his weapons, not for beauty." Christopher Tolkien added in a note to that another draft puts this slightly more fully. "They give it in tribute to Sauron, who has long been gathering and hoarding all that he can find. It is not known why, not for beauty, but for some secret purpose in the making of weapons of war." So, although Mithril is both beautiful and valuable, that's not why Sauron wanted it. He wanted it for making weapons of war. Which, again, makes sense. Sauron had a continent to conquer, after all. And he is a smith, let's not forget. Not just good at making rings and other jewellery. He apprenticed in Valinor under Aula, the Valor of Smithing, and was considered mighty in his power and lore there. His instinct was to make things, and to do that, he needed the best raw materials available. But rather confusingly, we don't see that Mithril anywhere. His army displays no Mithril weapons, and even the one great weapon of his that we do see, Grond, the battering ram that broke the gates of Minas Tirith, does not seem to be made from Mithril. That was made from black steel, not the shimmering silver of Mithril. It also doesn't seem that Sauron's chief lieutenants are given Mithril weapons or armour. To be sure, the Nazgul already had some quite formidable weaponry. Those Morgul blades are quite impressive for starters, but if the Witch King, say, had been wearing a Mithril mantle rather than whatever else that mantle was made of, would Merry's sword still be able to shear through it, as we read in the book, magical as it was? I guess we'll never know. Similarly, the mouth of Sauron doesn't seem to be wearing or using any Mithril either. So what sorts of weapons of war are we talking about here? I think there are two main options. First, Sauron was constructing, or already had constructed, some Mithril armour and weapons for himself. We don't really see Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, and the films took a stylistic choice to represent him only as that eye atop the Black Tower, but he did have a physical form. Gollum, for example, mentions that he only had 4 fingers on one hand. He was no longer in control of the form he took, having to take the form of an evil overlord with one finger chopped off, but he was definitely there. And he was definitely planning and expecting to recapture the ring at some point soon, which would further increase his power. In ages past, he had never been shy about going out and actually fighting. He obviously did in the War of the Last Alliance, for example. And what happened then was that he was thrown down in killing Gil-galad and Elendil, and then the One Ring was cut from his hand. Sauron was a proud man. Well, a proud Meyer. Might he have blamed not himself for what happened, but his tools, his armour? Might he have thought that next time, if there were a next time, he would be wearing better, stronger armour and would be unbeatable? It makes perfect sense. So that's the first option. The second is that he was making some even greater and more horrific weapon that we simply don't know about, because it doesn't make an appearance in the story we read. Sauron was clearly building up his forces in the build-up to the war, but realistically he will have seen the battles that happened on the page as just the first act of his conquest of all Middle-earth. There is every reason to believe that had events not started to speed up with the ring coming into play and Aragorn challenging him, he would have taken a bit more time to keep building up his army. He rushed his army onto the battlefield in reaction to that challenge from Aragorn in a way that he perhaps might not have done had the ring stayed hidden. And it is clear that he didn't see Minas Tirith as the biggest challenge in his conquest, just the first significant one. He actually only committed a fraction of his forces into the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. We see that much larger force that stayed within Mordor when the Black Gate opens as Aragorn and Gandalf arrive to challenge him. He only committed enough of his army to take Minas Tirith as he thought he would need, and he probably would have been right but for the unforeseeable interventions from both the Rohirrim and Aragorn. They were winning until then. Grond, that great battering ram, was extremely effective at the one job it had, breaking the great gates of the city. It was clearly something forged for that very purpose. So I think it's a fair assumption that Sauron might have been forging things for other challenges ahead. He can have expected the Lonely Mountain, Rivendell, Lothlorien, and plenty of other places to resist him once Gondor was defeated. Might he not have devised mighty weapons to attack them too, like he did with Grond and Minas Tirith? And might they not have been made, at least in part, from Mithril? It seems like a pretty reasonable working assumption. To take just one random example, we know from Galadriel that Lothlorien had magical defences and Sauron was probing them. After Frodo sees the Eye of Sauron in her mirror, Galadriel says this: "Do not think that only by singing amid the trees, nor even by the slender arrows of elven bows, is this land of Lothlorien maintained and defended against its enemy. I say to you, Frodo, that even as I speak to you, I perceive the Dark Lord and know his mind, or all of his mind that concerns the elves, and he gropes ever to see me and my thought. But still the door is closed." How might Sauron have been intending to get past that? We can only speculate, but he was clearly planning something. Those attacks on Lothlorien and some other places in the north that happen in the background of the War of the Ring don't seem like final concerted efforts to take those places, as much as efforts to keep the elves and other allies occupied while he took Minas Tirith, like he had the Corsairs of Umber harry the south coast of Gondor so they couldn't come to their capital's aid. It's also worth noting that at the time of writing The Lord of the Rings, on and off before, during and after World War II, Tolkien was despairing of the uses of modern technology in warfare. In writing to his son Christopher, for example, he says this: "It is the aeroplane of war that is the real villain, and nothing can really amend my grief that you, my best beloved, have any connection with it. My sentiments are more or less those that Frodo would have if he discovered some hobbits learning to ride Nazgul birds for the liberation of the Shire." And then later, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, "The news today about atomic bombs is so horrifying one is stunned. The utter folly of these lunatic physicists to consent to do such work for war purposes. calmly plotting the destruction of the world. Tolkien's views on war are a lot more nuanced than these two short extracts would suggest, but his horror at the industrialization of the world and the mechanization of warfare is palpable. As his chief villain in this story, we can surely expect Sauron to have been doing similar, if darker, more magical and Middle-earthy things. We know Sauron was devising horrific weapons of war to be used in his conquests. We know that he was using Mithril for this very purpose, and we know the likely targets for them. The fact that Tolkien never shows us exactly what those weapons were like should probably be a mercy, and was almost certainly a deliberate decision by him. Although we might think of The Lord of the Rings as being shot through with hope and all good things, Tolkien himself had a very different idea, thinking it too dark and terrifying already. He wrote to his publisher to say that, "I have produced a monster, an immensely long, complex, rather bitter and very terrifying romance, quite unfit for children, if fit for anybody." Of course, Tolkien didn't want to include something he probably thought even more terrifying. Why was Sauron eagerly gathering Mithril? To create weapons of war so terrible, Tolkien dare not even write them into his story. Our imaginations can fill any gaps that are needed. If you'd like to see more videos like this, breaking down Tolkien's legendarium in nerdy detail, please click on the playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page appearing now on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.